Tension grips the USS Arleigh Burke as it locks onto its target. The crew exchanges nervous glances, fully aware that at this range, a Tomahawk strike is their best option. The order is given. The crew braces themselves as they prepare to launch the missile. And then, nothing. No missile ripping through the air at 550 miles per hour. No impact, just silence. The ship sits helpless in enemy waters. A sitting duck, a death sentence. On today's episode of the Infographics Show, we'll reveal the real reason the US military is running out of Tomahawk missiles, making this chilling scenario a very real possibility. Yes, you heard that right. The US military is running out of Tomahawk missiles. This isn't an exaggeration, it's not some clickbait headline. It's a cold, hard fact. And it's not just bad news, it's a disaster in the making. The Tomahawk Land Attack Missile, or TLAM, is one of the Navy's premier weapons, a tool of raw power like no other. It's what the Navy uses to strike deep into enemy territory with surgical precision. But if current trends continue, the US military won't be able to rely on this heavy hitter much longer, and that is a problem it can't afford. One look at the Tomahawk's capabilities and you'll understand why these incredible missiles aren't just important, they are indispensable. The Tomahawk is a long-range subsonic cruise missile launched from US Navy ships and submarines. It can deliver either conventional or a nuclear payload, though the latter has been gradually phased out. Still, the Tomahawk remains an absolute powerhouse of modern warfare. We'll let the numbers speak for themselves. The Tomahawk missile can be launched from over 140 US Navy ships and submarines, including 4 converted Ohio-class submarines. With a reach of more than 900 miles, this range allows it to strike targets deep behind enemy lines, all while keeping the crew safely out of harm's way. But it's not just the range that makes Tomahawk missiles so remarkable. It's the combination of cutting-edge technology and raw firepower packed into a missile that measures just over 20 feet in length. With a 1,000-pound payload, the Tomahawk missile is designed to incapacitate high-value, heavily defended targets. Its powerful warhead can take out fortified enemy command centers, disable air bases, and destroy missile sites. And let's be honest, the weight of the missile alone should have tipped us off about its destructive capabilities. We're talking about roughly 2,900 pounds of sheer force. The initial strike is often the first wave of a devastating campaign, aimed at overwhelming and neutralizing the enemy's most critical assets, all before they even know what hit them. The Tomahawk has become the Navy's go-to first strike weapon in the opening moments of conflict. What sets it apart is not just its range and precision, but its ability to loiter over a target, just like a drone would. The Tomahawk bides its time, waiting for the perfect moment to strike, and when it does, it wreaks absolute havoc. However, it's important to note that only the Block 4 and Block 5 Tomahawk missiles have this loitering capability. They can loiter for hours and change course instantly when commanded. But what does a Block 4 and Block 5 even mean? Let's briefly break down the Tomahawk development history to explain. This will also help us understand why the US military is running out of these missiles. The Tomahawk's development began in the 1970s. At the time, General Dynamics led the charge to fulfill the Navy's need for a low-altitude missile capable of avoiding radar detection. And this foundational goal set the stage for decades of innovation, as each new variant addressed a new operational need. The initial Block 1 versions, including the TLAM-N nuclear variant and the TASM anti-ship missile, had a range of up to 1,550 miles, with the TLAM-N carrying a 200-kiloton nuclear warhead. Accuracy, though, was a bit rough by today's standards, with a circular error probable of 260 feet. While these early models set the stage for the missile's success, they quickly became outdated. Fast forward to the 1990s and Block 2 variants entered the scene, dramatically improving the missile's precision and targeting capabilities. The TLAM-C and TLAM-D were now capable of striking with an accuracy of less than 33 feet. The range remained impressive, with the ship-launched version reaching about 800 miles and the submarine-launched version stretching to almost 580 miles. These missiles were used extensively in the Gulf War, where they achieved a remarkable 85% success rate in hitting their targets. In the 2010s, Block 3 brought the Tomahawk to the forefront of modern missile technology. And it wasn't just about accuracy anymore, the missile also featured GPS navigation, which reduced mission planning time from 80 hours to only an hour. A new turbofan engine also improved fuel efficiency by 3% while boosting thrust by 20%, adding more power and range to the missile. Now we're in the era of Block 4, which is by far the most advanced version of the Tomahawk. This variant can be reprogrammed during its flight to hit fresh targets, a feature that turns them into mid-flight GPS-guided assassins. The Block 4 Tomahawk entered service in 2004, and in 2020 the US Navy began recertifying and modernizing it. Since its inception, the Block 4 has been used in several key engagements. In 2008, 2 Tomahawks targeted al-Qaeda militant Saleh Ali Saleh Nabhan in Somalia, followed by another strike in an al-Qaeda training camp in Yemen in 2009. In 2014, the U.S. fired 47 Tomahawks at Islamic State positions in Syria, including Raqqa and Aleppo. The 2017 Sherat Air Base strike saw 59 Tomahawks launched in response to the Khan Sheikhoun chemical attack, followed by 66 missiles in 2018 targeting Syrian facilities after the Douma chemical attack. But these numbers pale in comparison to earlier Tomahawk deployments. The 1991 Gulf War saw the first major combat deployment of the Tomahawk. A total of 288 Tomahawks were launched, with 276 fired from surface ships and 12 from submarines. The missile was also heavily used in Operation Desert Fox in 1998, when 325 Tomahawks were fired at key Iraqi targets, further cementing the Tomahawk as a reliable weapon for sustained air campaigns. During the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the Tomahawk was a vital component, with over 800 missiles fired to strike crucial targets during the initial phases of Operation Iraqi Freedom. So, how did the U.S. go from deploying hundreds of Tomahawk missiles in major conflicts without hesitation to facing concerns over running out of them today? Well, firing off missiles at such a rapid pace is one major factor, but it's not the only one. Let's break down the key reasons why the U.S. is running low on Tomahawk missiles. But first, how many Tomahawk missiles does the U.S. military even have? Well, the exact number is classified, but the Wall Street Journal estimated that in 2022, the U.S. stockpile was around 4,000 of these missiles. Besides their combat use, an estimated 100 Tomahawks are consumed every year for testing and training. 4,000 missiles might not sound like a shortage. In fact, it's more than what many nations with cruise missile capabilities have combined. But when you break it down, that number shrinks fast. The real issue isn't just how many missiles the U.S. has, but how quickly they're being used. And that brings us back to an old thorn in America's side, the Houthis. In 2016, the U.S. launched just 5 Tomahawks against this armed group, but by 2024, the situation had escalated dramatically. Backed by Iran, the Houthis are now wreaking havoc in the Red Sea, launching attacks on international shipping, U.S. naval vessels, and civilian merchant ships. In response, the U.S. stepped up its game, using Tomahawks to disable Houthi missile systems, air defense networks, and drone launchers. But these strikes haven't been a quick one-and-done deal. They've been ongoing month after month, with each round of missile launches eating through the U.S. arsenal at an alarming pace. On January 11, 2024 alone, the Navy fired more than 80 Tomahawks at the Iranian-backed group. These missiles were launched from the USS Philippine Sea, USS Dwight D. Eisenhower, USS Gravely, USS Mason, and USS Florida. And remember how we mentioned that the Tomahawks are often used to kick off a military campaign? That is exactly the case here. Those 80 missiles were just the first day of the attacks. The initial Tomahawk strike hit 30 key locations, targeting Houthi command and control nodes, missile sites, and radar stations. They aimed to dismantle the group's capability to threaten maritime security. By July 14th, the date when the deployment of the Eisenhower carrier strike group targeting the Houthis ended, the U.S. had launched a total of 135 Tomahawks. Now again, compared to 4,000, 135 sounds like a small number. It's a little over 3% of the entire U.S. TLAM arsenal. But in 2023, the year before these attacks, the U.S. military purchased only 55 Tomahawk missiles. This number isn't enough to replace even the missiles fired on the first day of the attacks against the Houthis, let alone the entire campaign. It's not just a few missiles fired here and there. That's a real drain on the resources. And the need for more missiles doesn't slow down after the Eisenhower carrier strike group left the Red Sea. In late 2024, the group was just replaced by the Harry S. Truman carrier strike group, proving how much of a problem the Houthis still were. And this carrier strike group got right back to business. On January 3, 2025, it launched another series of Tomahawk missiles against key Houthi infrastructure in Yemen. And as always, the targets included command and control centers, weapon production facilities, and storage sites. The Navy is targeting these locations over and over again because these strikes are necessary to keep the Red Sea secure. But the more the Navy fires, the closer it comes to emptying the very stockpile it needs for future operations. Some 2 weeks later, the Houthis stopped attacking vessels in the Red Sea, for now at least. But while the immediate pressure eased, the problem for the U.S. Navy remained. Using so many Tomahawk missiles wouldn't be a problem if the U.S. military was replacing them in time, but it isn't. Far from it. Washington has consistently been behind the curve when it comes to replenishing its arsenal, especially missiles like the Tomahawk. The procurement process is slow, and it's not the first time the U.S. military has faced this problem. The Pentagon has a long history of playing catch-up when it comes to munitions procurement. Take the last decade as an example. A solid $2.8 billion was spent on buying 1,200 Tomahawk missiles. Break that number down, and you get only around 8 new missiles per ship for the Navy's 140-plus Tomahawk launching vessels. So not quite enough to stay stocked for a world full of rising threats. and 2025 isn't bringing any changes in this department. The Pentagon requested only 22 new Tomahawks. But it gets better. Instead of investing in new stockpiles, the Pentagon is prioritizing something even more head-scratching, upgrading existing Tomahawks to the new Block 5 versions. And this is a problem. The Block 5 Tomahawks are essentially souped-up versions of older missiles with an extended range and some fancier electronics, but those Block 5 upgrades take years to complete. You've got to decommission the old Block 4 models, strip them down, and retrofit them with shiny new tech. That's not exactly a buy-it-and-forget-it situation. But the Navy is determined eventually every Tomahawk in the fleet will be upgraded to a Block 5. Instead of simply buying new missiles to keep up with demand, the U.S. is sticking with a slower approach, taking existing stockpiles and putting them through a long, drawn-out upgrade process. But this process can't possibly keep pace with the rate at which the missiles are being used, creating a critical gap in America's cruise missile arsenal. But this problem isn't exclusive to the Tomahawk missiles. The U.S. military is running low on all kinds of munitions, and for pretty much the same reasons. The U.S. has a long history of mismanaging munition production, and it's now facing some serious shortages. The Navy, for example, halted torpedo production after the Cold War, convinced there was enough inventory for a fleet without a real threat. Then, China started flexing its muscles, and suddenly those torpedoes needed to be built again. But you can't just hit refresh on the programs. Vendors had to rework outdated designs from the 1990s, and missile manufacturers needed to ramp up their testing and production capabilities just to meet demand. And they still can't keep up. The Standard Missile-2 SM-2 has been the Navy's air defense workhorse since the 1970s. Now we have the SM-6, which can handle more advanced threats like hypersonic missiles, but there aren't nearly enough of them. The U.S.'s 2024 budget only asked for 125 SM-6s, barely enough to arm every destroyer in the fleet with a handful of missiles. At this rate, entire ships could be sent to sea with no SM-6s on board. To understand how pitiful the procurement process has gotten, all you need to know is that back in the 1980s, the former President Ronald Reagan requested nearly 1,400 SM-2s in a single year. So it's no wonder that the National Defense Commission recently reported that the U.S. industrial base is grossly inadequate to meet the needs of modern warfare, even during peacetime. The system is slow, bureaucratic, and shockingly unprepared for the kind of high-volume munitions production needed in today's world. So when the next big conflict comes along, don't be surprised if the military finds itself running on fumes. And that next big conflict might come sooner than you would expect. Like, say, tomorrow. After all, 2025 is the year Taiwan's military predicted China would be ready to invade. The last time the U.S. needed a huge missile stockpile in a war was in 2003 during the invasion of Iraq. Then the military launched about 800 Tomahawks in the initial phase. Today, it would take the U.S. a full decade to replenish, and fighting China would require about 400 Tomahawks for just 3 weeks of conflict, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In total, the U.S. would need over 5,000 missiles for the same period. Even if the U.S. managed to acquire more missiles, getting them resupplied would be an entirely different challenge. China wouldn't just sit back, it would likely impose a blockade and launch long-range strikes on any cargo ships attempting to reach Taiwan. Every resupply mission would turn into a high-risk operation, forcing the U.S. to fight just to keep its stockpiles replenished. But don't think that China will only play defense. The country has been on a missile buying spree for quite a while now. U.S. officials estimate that China is acquiring weapons at a pace 5 to 6 times faster than the U.S. To make matters worse, the U.S. is spending 20 times more money to get the same capability, and China is still ahead. So with that backdrop, the U.S. is not only running low on missiles but also playing catch-up to a China that's outspending and outproducing at every turn. In the time it takes the U.S. to manufacture a single Tomahawk, China could have dozens of its own long-range missiles ready to launch. But if the U.S. faces China in a Taiwan invasion scenario, running out of Tomahawks is only one part of the problem. Sure, those missiles are crucial for a potential U.S.-China conflict because they reduce reliance on naval aviation. However, the problem is much bigger than a few hundred Tomahawks. The U.S. is up against an industrial gap, and China's weapon stockpile and acquisition rates are simply leaving them in the dust. Unless the Pentagon gets its act together, things could get disastrous very quickly. So, has it? Has the Pentagon gotten its act together? Well, it's certainly trying. The U.S. is working on expanding Tomahawk production, but it's a slower process than many would like. One of the biggest issues with missile production is the lack of consistent large orders. The U.S. has historically placed small, inconsistent orders for Tomahawks, which makes it hard for defense contractors to ramp up production. so the Pentagon is now advocating for multi-year contracts, which would provide a more predictable, stable demand for key munitions. This was the approach used during World War II, and it successfully boosted production in a short time. The Pentagon is also taking steps to deal with supply chain bottlenecks that have been slowing down missile production. For example, rocket motors and certain electronics have been a critical limiting factor. The Navy has allocated $380 million in its fiscal year 2024 budget to address some of these issues. In addition, it's pursuing a second vendor for certain critical components and modernizing production facilities to speed up the overall process. But the Navy isn't the only one expected to help increase production capacity, so are foreign military sales. Australia, Japan, and other nations are purchasing Tomahawks, which should help drive up production demand. Japan has purchased 400 Tomahawks, 200 Block 4 and 200 Block 5 variants, for an estimated $2.35 billion. Australia has secured a deal for up to 220 Tomahawks, 200 Block 5 and 20 Block 4 variants for $895 million, which will be deployed in its Hobart-class destroyers. However, it remains to be seen whether these foreign sales will substantially increase overall capacity. The Navy seems to be preparing for this increase either way. Its weapon spending has jumped to $6.9 billion from 2022 to 2024, a staggering 70% increase. One of the main driving factors behind this jump was improving the procurement of essential munitions, including Tomahawks. But this procurement must be ramped up immediately. This is the only way to ensure readiness by 2027, another year that has been repeatedly thrown around for a potential US-China clash over Taiwan. But what else should the Pentagon do to ensure readiness? Well, it should incorporate a broader, more integrated national defense strategy, including collaboration with the private sector, the civil sector, and industrial players. This mirrors China's approach, in which civilian companies and state-run conglomerates work together to prepare for wartime. This approach would help the Pentagon create a more agile, responsive, and scalable production system that can rise to the challenge in times of crisis, or crises to be more precise. Just because the Taiwan invasion is the most probable conflict doesn't mean it'll be the only one. So the Pentagon must be ready for potential conflicts against multiple global powers simultaneously. This requires boosting production across a variety of munitions, including Tomahawks, and ensuring that the US has enough firepower to handle multiple engagements at once. Without a reliable stockpile and rapid production capability, the US risks falling behind in a prolonged conflict. Modern warfare isn't just about technology and strategy, it's about sustainability. A military that can't replenish its arsenal quickly enough is a military that loses its advantage. The Pentagon must shift its focus from cost-cutting efficiency to wartime readiness, ensuring that munitions production can scale up when needed. Because when the next major conflict breaks out, having the best weapons won't matter if there aren't enough to keep fighting. Will the US be ready? Only time will tell. Is the US military's missile shortage just a temporary issue, or does it expose a major weakness in America's long-term warfighting capabilities? Should the Pentagon focus on ramping up production or invest in newer missile systems instead? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Now go check out What If USA Launched a Nuclear Bomb Minute by Minute, or click on this video instead.